Hi everybody. Welcome back to day 4 of the Solidarity Highlighting Marginal Voices in Academia, Practice and Society Conference. I hope you all have had a great lunch and have a good break. So I'm Katy, PhD candidate from the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Melbourne, and I'm here to continue to guide you through the rest of today's program. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are on and pay respects to their elders past and present. The African Studies Group, the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, and I recognize and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to their ancestral lands, which continue to be important to the First Nations people living today. So now we are going to have our second practitioner panel today, a book discussion on neither settler nor native, the making and unmaking of permanent minorities, published in November last year, authored by Professor Mahmood Mamdani, our keynote speaker who gave us a very fascinating lecture on Monday. So building on the lecture, this panel will critically engage the book, and we are very happy to have Associate Professor Sana Nakata as our chair of the panel. Sana is the Associate Dean, Indigenous and co-director of the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration at the Faculty of Arts of the University of Melbourne. She has been trained as a lawyer and a political theorist. Her research is centered upon developing an approach for thinking politically about childhood in ways that can improve the capacity of adult decision makers in the interest of the children. In the recent, she has completed an ARC Discovery Indigenous Research Fellowship looking at children representation in Australian political controversies. She is the author of the book Childhood Citizenship, Governance and Policy. She is also a co-editor of the Springer book series, Indigenous Settler Relations in Australia and the World. So without further ado, may I now hand over the time to Sana so we can start the panel. Please welcome Sana.
Thank you so much, Katy, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's book discussion of our keynote, a keynoter from this conference, Professor Mahmood Mamdani's Neither Settler Nor Native. As Katy's explained, one of my roles at the University of Melbourne is as co-director of a research unit that is named as the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration. And in that work, people who have worked with me know that I have often reflected how I, as a Torres Strait Islander, someone named by a 1938 piece of state legislation, and also as someone born to both the dispossessors and the dispossessed of this continent, how I think of myself as someone who lives not on one side of the Indigenous settler binary, but as someone who lives in the hyphen in between. And indeed, in line with some of Professor Mamdani's contributions, is always seeking to try and find a way of thinking of oneself and experiencing the world outside of those colonial constructions. Thinking these things and finding ways of saying so out loud can sometimes feel like dangerous provocations and often make oneself vulnerable to misunderstanding. But it is in the pursuit of these provocative ideas we go. So today it's my great pleasure to reintroduce Professor Mahmood Mamdani, who offered a generous and very exciting keynote for this conference on Monday this week. I hope you've all seen it, and that if so, you will already know that among many significant achievements, he is today the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University, the author of several books, including the prize-winning Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, as well as writing essays in New Left Review and the London Review of Books. And he's been formally recognised multiple times as a public intellectual of significance. So he's been kind enough to give our audience at this conference more time this week by being part of today's book discussion with Professor Karen Farquharson and Dr. Hamza bin Jehangir. I'm going to introduce all our panelists, Karen and Hamza, very briefly, and then I'll pass on to Karen and then to Hamza and then to Professor Mamdani in turn before opening up for a discussion across the panel and to our audience for Q&A participation. Karen Farquharson is a professor of sociology, as well as the vice president of academic board here at the University of Melbourne. And she also happens to be my most recent head of school in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Her research explores the sociology of race and racism, ethnicity and diversity, primarily in the context of media and sport, but also further afield than that. And she opens today's panel discussion with her reflections on Professor Mamdani's book. Karen will then be followed by Dr. Hamza bin Jehangir, who is lecturer in political science and whose research focuses on the relationship between Western and non-Western political thought, with a particular interest in methodological approaches to comparative political theory. He's currently working on a book that explores practice-based approaches to comparative political theory. That's it from me. I'm really looking forward to chairing this discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Karen to open the discussion today.
Thank you, Sana. And thank you, African Studies Group, for inviting me to be on this panel today, which to discuss this interesting and very provocative book. So Mahmood Mamdani's Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities is a tour de force of a book that provides both an analysis of the contemporary nation state and a utopian vision of the state decoupled from the nation, realized through a process he terms decolonizing the political. This process involves, quote unquote, stripping away the nation or the tribe as nation as a locus of political identification and commitment. And this is a very ambitious book. And in this book, Mamdani analyzes why so many post-colonial states end up perpetrating extreme violence against minority groups. He argues that these new nation states are creating themselves in the image of the colonizer, an image that involves the creation of permanent minorities that are dominated by a cultural or ethnic majority. A key question for Mamdani, among others, because the book has so many layers to it, and I'm only going to touch on a few things. A key question for him is about belonging and who belongs. Answering this involves recognizing that political identities are historical and therefore changeable, not natural and not set. Who belongs and on whose terms? In his utopian vision, everyone in the territory should belong. And the state then perhaps is reduced to being an administrator of goods and services to the benefit of all. He prefers South Africa's transition from apartheid to non-racialism as an example of the process of decolonizing the political. And I have to say, I enjoyed reading about South Africa because I was in South Africa in 1995 doing research for my PhD on the transition from apartheid to post-apartheid, from a racist to a non-racial state. South Africa was an avowedly racist state, with wealth distributed along racial lines and racism actively and violently policed by the state. The struggle against apartheid was both peaceful and violent at different times on the part of the state and upon the part of the strugglers. The struggle eventually united non-white South Africans under a moniker of Blackness and included whites who were supportive of the cause. So the Black South Africans, part of the strategy of apartheid, and Mamdani reflects on this, was basically, and not just in the South African context, was to divide and conquer. Splitting up the African groups into multiple groups so that they would think they had different interests. And one of the real successes of the struggle against apartheid was the joint coming together of non-white groups under the kind of umbrella of Blackness. This joint struggle detribalized Blacks, uniting them in a common cause and preventing the tribalism that many post-colonial states succumb to. The tribalism that often ends up with states perpetrating ethnic cleansing against minorities while aiming to foster social cohesion through cultural homogeneity. The struggle against apartheid ended up with a negotiated solution. While the struggle was violent at times, the end was not, and the post-colonial state is not. And this Mamdani attributes to its model. How can detribalized, deracialized states cohere? South Africa provides a purposefully different alternative, a nation that coheres around a narrative of non-racialism and multiculturalism, though they call that Rainbow Nation. This was an explicit and purposeful nation building process. And when I was there, it was happening all the time. South Africa's new constitution, while remaining aspirational in many ways, provides rights to all citizens, regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or anything else. South African nation building, however, did not erase ethnicity. Rather, it recreated itself as a rainbow nation. The rainbow needs all of its colors to be beautiful, and all of the colors are equally beautiful. Social cohesion means that everyone is valued equally, but they can maintain their own beliefs and cultural practices. The non-racial rainbow nation is an ideal, not without its challenges, but it aspires to include all. It is nevertheless a nation state with the idea of South Africanness uniting its citizens. It still has borders and security. And I guess that's a question for Professor Mamdani around what would a nation and a state decoupled from nation do around borders? Australia is not yet a post-colonial nation. The chapter of Neither Settler Nor Native that most resonated with me regarding the Australian situation was chapter 1, the Indian question in the United States. Mamdani in the book distinguishes between settlers and migrants, noting that while the two are often conflated, they are conceptually very different. The immigrant engages with existing political structures. When I migrated to Australia, I wasn't coming here to overthrow the existing political structures. The settler creates new structures. It doesn't want to engage with the existing structure, but the settler wants to create new structures. If colonists were immigrants, they would have joined local indigenous societies, not displaced them. He argues that colonists and new post-colonial states manage minority groups or original inhabitants, indigenous peoples, through ethnic cleansing, most commonly through genocide, where they're simply obliterated, and population displacement, where they're placed on reserves, internment camps, homelands, whatever, away from the majority of the colonizers, concentration camps. Mamdani characterizes the American treatment of its indigenous inhabitants as ethnic cleansing in the form of genocide, forced migration, and legal and economic coercion. The remaining natives, after ethnic cleansing, so they had genocide, got rid of most people, those who were left were put on reserve and permanently separated from the settler state through the Constitution in a system called tribal sovereignty. If that sounds familiar, it was mirrored here. Settlers, and here there are all kinds of layers to it. Just like in the US, but some locally specific. Settlers justified the treatment of what Mamdani calls natives because they considered natives to be uncivilized and therefore not people. The God-given task of the settler was first to civilize, because the uncivilized have no sovereignty. In Australia, settlers literally argued that the land was unoccupied through the idea of the doctrine of terra nullius, unoccupied. They denied the humanity of the First Nations people here, and this denial is enshrined in our Constitution. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not considered citizens until 1967. They can be and are still treated differently to non-Indigenous Australians, and the ability to do that is lawful. Indigenous peoples, First Nations people here have been asking for, demanding a voice, a truth-telling process, a treaty, literally for decades. A key difference between the United States and Australia is the visibility of First Nations people. While extremely disadvantaged, Australia's First Nations people are nevertheless part of the discourse. They might be a problem to be solved for white Australia, perhaps, but a fight for sovereignty and justice for First Nations peoples themselves. Does the book provide conceptual tools to further their political project? Mamdani's analysis of the US case highlights the problem with conflating racism and colonization. He argues that in the US, racism has been the focus and colonization has been ignored. In the focus on racism, the effects of ethnic cleansing on First Nations people have been brushed aside, and as a result, their plight is virtually invisible. He notes that African Americans have been used for labor, while First Nations people were the source of the land. This difference is important, and this difference is actually essential in the Australian context, because our main issue is the land and the dispossession of the land and the fact that we are all living on stolen land and the tension that that creates. So back to the US situation, while African Americans and Native Americans have both had to deal with racism, the issue of the land has led to a whole different disciplinary regime for Native Americans that has situated them as wards of the state. Mamdani asserts that the US can only decolonize if it realizes it is a colonial state. And he further argues that it will not be able to decolonize while the colonized assert that they are sovereign, which is a very provocative thing to say. Colonization is a legal process, not just a cultural one. As long as Native Americans are wards of the state, nothing will change. The situation in Australia is uncannily similar. We have a whole separate disciplinary regime to manage Indigenous peoples. They remain constitutionally a special case. Our aim to be socially cohesive through multiculturalism specifically excludes our First Nations. New migrants arrive, the population grows, but the treatment of First Nations peoples remains abysmal. The violence perpetrated by the nation state against First Nations peoples is substantial and specific. Just last week, another Indigenous person was killed in custody, died in custody, was killed, was in the custody of the state and died, another one. The book provides a good diagnosis about why we are where we are. It is interesting how similar the colonized systems are the world over, which is indeed part of Mamdani's argument that the current system stems from the United States version of colonization. However, the book doesn't tackle how change could occur in systems like ours, and I would love to hear your views on this, Professor Mamdani. How do we recognize that we need to colonize when those in power benefit from the status quo? What could decolonization look like here and in the United States? Most of us live on stolen land, the outcome of genocide and continued population transfer, including the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. What would reparations, which Mamdani argues for, look like for First Nations people in this context? The one successful source of change that the book discusses in detail is the role of violence. And I'm going to give a long quote here. Where Mamdani argues that, this is the quote, "Violence is an act of constructing the political community. Rather than aberrational, it is essential. Violence is a means of defining who is a member and who is not, where the boundaries of the community lie. As such, political violence tells us that something is amiss in the political community. Someone who wants membership is being denied. Someone who is a member wants to expel others. Political violence contests boundaries of membership in both these ways." It's the end of the quote. When things are amiss in terms of who belongs, violence can be an outcome. That hasn't been the case here. Mamdani says that reform and violence are dialectical. They're in conversation with each other. Violence can lead to reform, and also it can be prevented through reform. How does reform occur in a situation like ours and in the United States, where Indigenous peoples are small minorities and the majority and larger minorities are not willing, for the most part, to work with Indigenous peoples to effect change? It is quite different from the South African situation when the overwhelming majority of the population was disadvantaged through apartheid. Honestly, justice for First Nations people in Australia seems out of reach, despite being desperately needed. It is a backdrop to everything in our society. Yet there are glimmers of hope. In 2017, a large number of First Nations people got together and developed the Uluru Statement from the Heart, calling for a First Nations voice in the Constitution and a Makerere Commission to supervise a process of treaty making between governments and First Nations. This year, 2021, the Victorian government started a Truth and Justice Commission, the Uruk Justice Commission, which will investigate crimes and injustices perpetrated against Aboriginal peoples in settlement with an aim of truth-telling, truth-listening, and developing recommendations for reform. Parallel to this in Victoria is a treaty-making process. Other states are also investigating treaties with First Nations people. Perhaps this is the start of our negotiated outcome. Mamdani finishes his book with a call for all of us to be neither settler nor native. He says that we have to come to terms with our past, to acknowledge and understand history. And when we do, we will realize that we are all colonized, whether settler or native. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Karen. We are going to hand over to Hamza, who's also going to offer an engagement with Professor Mamdani's book, and then I'll return to invite Mamdani to respond. Mahmood Mamdani to respond.
Thank you very much, Sana, and thank you especially to the African Studies Group for the invitation and for organizing this conference and bringing this all together. So I'll start with three things that I loved about the book and how it forced me to rethink the practice of political theory, and then I'll raise three questions. And at any point, if I think I'm running over time, I'll just cut short. So the first three things that I learned, that I loved about the book, and it forced me to rethink the practice of political theory. The first is regarding history. So reading history in a way which brings together different colonial practices and governmental efforts from different regions. This is vitally important because most social scientific research and also some research in the humanities is stuck within the framework of the nation state as the default container of politics. Scholars do not usually engage with different histories, and they consequently do not undertake the work required to bring these histories together in the same frame. One way the book does so is by removing the Holocaust as an exceptional moment in an otherwise feel-good European history and placing it alongside violence against indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. Rather than look at the violence in Europe as a particularly German or a European affair, which other parts of the world cannot really draw on, this book allows us to read violence as reflecting a broader paradigm of colonization. Second point that I liked. The most interesting chapter for me in the book was on Sudan. There is plenty of mainstream scholarship within settler colonial and post-colonial context now on the United States, Nazi Germany, and South Africa. But little attention has been paid to the way we can learn from Sudan, especially in terms of the failed policy of partition, itself a colonial device. Especially the differentiation between Arab and African is quite a telling one for me, and it resonated with me because of my South Asian background, another region of the world where partition has wreaked quite a lot of havoc. My third point follows from the kind of openings the book creates. And again, I refer to the chapter on Sudan here. So this basically creates an opening to think about South-South theorization of the political. So basically, how do we think about places like Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, South Sudan and North Sudan, together in theoretical terms? What sort of lessons can we draw about majority-minority politics and their attendant normative effects? Can we potentially think of these different locations as joined together by conceptual and political legacies of colonial violence and policies, especially in terms of the anti-colonial thought that we see in response to imperial and colonial formations of the political? So this is what leads me to my first question. And this question follows from the quote on page 26. And the quote is this. Mamdani writes, what emerged from indirect rule was a new kind of political community in which colonized groups were subdivided into territorial homelands and made subject to separate legal regimes. So my question is, what is the role of anti-colonial thought as a resource for thinking about decolonization of the political? Which ideas, imaginaries, and modes of constructing the self, and here the self, is it the community, the individual, or the nation, can we draw on to shape the way we take part in the decolonization of the political? I want to highlight two themes that connect with arguments around decolonization from the book: themes of minority nationalisms from colonial India, and how they constitute debates on post-colonial identity, state boundaries, and boundaries of different religious and political communities leading up to the partition of India and the British exit. First of these can be seen in exchanges and debates between Gandhi and Ambedkar in South Asia, who were critical interlocutors in the very problematics that the book highlights. These are formulation of political difference and its operationalization in governmental efforts to divide and rule, create public order, and gift of the rule of law in the colony. Gandhi, for example, offers a severe critique of the colonial state and its modus operandi. He offers a severe critique of lawyers, particularly in his book in Swaraj. He basically makes the claim that they are agents of the colonial state and they are not to be trusted as they sow division between brothers. They instigate fight over property in particular. And we should remember Gandhi is a lawyer himself. Here, property is not just understood as a contractually owned, as safeguarding contractually owned land, but also as a particular kind of political subjectivity, which forces us to think about religion as property, the nation as property. The concept of property and its intended idea of interest, as in self-interest, is a subject of wide-ranging critique from Gandhi. He's also particularly cognizant of how political difference is created by the colonial state's operation of neutrality and treatment of all groups as pure interest groups, following the category of interest. So here the colonial state claims that it is neutral because it has no association, either ideological or in pure representative terms, with either Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, or other religious groups in India. Therefore, he disagrees with Ambedkar, the brilliant Dalit leader and political theorist, as well as the architect of the Constitution of India. In colonial India, when Ambedkar makes the argument for separate electorates under indirect rule for Dalits or the untouchables, Gandhi goes on a fast unto death until British withdraw their support for Ambedkar's demands. On the other hand, Ambedkar offers a critique of the tradition of Hinduism and the prospect of majority rule by upper caste Hindus in an independent India. He challenges the homogeneous categorization of Hindus as a governable category. He challenges due to hierarchical, oppressive, and extractive relationships of caste. Ambedkar's key claim is summarized in his claim that Dalits aren't even Hindu because no fellow religionist would treat their co-religionists like Dalits are treated by upper caste Hindus. Or in his quote, in every Hindu, the consciousness that exists is the consciousness of his caste. That is the reason why Hindus cannot be said to form a society or nation. First, this is the challenge to the homogeneous category of the Hindu and reminds us of resistance against the colonial move that Mamdani perfectly describes as imposition of a native subjectivity on an entire population. Second, this makes the post-colonial nationalist project based on Hindu majority difficult because here you have a whole set of people from within one religion stating that they're not a part of that religion. So that has real practical political effects on territorial control and demarcation of boundaries in independent India. Ultimately, because partition of India will literally take place by counting Muslim majority versus Hindu majority areas and then making decisions on which territory goes to India and Pakistan. On the other hand is Muslim nationalism in India, which is another form of minority nationalism, itself a direct consequence of religious difference being legally coded to govern different communities via their own standards of customary law. This is the very British idea that Mamdani expounds on the book. This idea that we need to be careful of native sentiments and traditions. These traditions are then coded into legal categories. However, one of the points that I would like to bring up here is that it would be erroneous to say that Islamic law and associated traditions of jurisprudence are just byproducts of the way the colonial state has tried to govern tradition and then has tried to, like, for example, repackage tradition and give it back to the natives. It is better to think of these traditions as transmuted through the process of colonization, how as a domain of knowledge, they are filtered through modernist assumptions and categories, which carry epistemic consequences. So then there's a real concern in this sort of politics with who is a Muslim. And this sort of question gains raising importance, particularly in the contemporary era as well, around war on terror and Islamophobia. And this problematic is seen in action with the category of Ahmadis, a specific sect amongst Muslims whose temporal emergence as a group amongst Muslims in colonial India has rendered them forever suspicious as agents of empire amongst majority Muslims in post-colonial Pakistan. In post-colonial Pakistan, constitutionally speaking, Ahmadis are not allowed to refer to themselves as Muslims at all. It's criminal if they do so. They are not allowed to pray in mosques. They are not allowed to refer to their prayer sites as mosques either. They cannot be buried in Muslim graveyards. And when they sign up for their passport or for a national identity card, they have to declare themselves as Ahmadis rather than as Muslims. There are acts of public discrimination and violence against Ahmadis to the point that much of the community has had to leave Pakistan for the fear of their safety. Much like Dalits, Ahmadis play a consequential role in debates over tradition and authenticity in colonial India because their very temporal emergence as a sect in colonial India raises questions about the integrity of Muslims as a minority political community and who constitutes this community. This has consequences then for the partition of India, which again is undertaken through counting of majority of Hindus and Muslims, and then demarcating these territories as either Pakistani or Indian. So here, basically, the claim that Ahmadis are not Muslim has political consequences for the division of India. Because if they aren't Muslim, then why should they be counted as a part of the Muslim community for purposes of determining majority and minority areas for the colonial partition? Consequently, Ahmadis present themselves as Muslim to the British and are therefore counted as Muslims in the leading up to the creation of Pakistan, but subsequently rendered Ahmadi rather than Muslim in the constitutional framework of post-colonial Pakistan, especially from 1970s onwards. My point in giving this brief overview of minority nationalisms under colonial rule in India is to push Dr. Mamdani to engage with this intellectual and political history of anti-colonialism and perhaps its pitfalls. And this type of anti-colonialism is not exclusive to South Asia. It is visible in Australia, in the United States, and in other parts of the world. The colonized have written, and they have written well. They have written critically. They have spoken back to the empire, and not always in the terms that neatly confirm Orientalist and colonial demarcations of native traditions. So my purpose here is to pose the question of which strands of anti-colonial thought and practice can we take up to inform the decolonization of the political? Can these histories and ideas they make visible be used to theorize contemporary problematic of post-colonial modernity? Or do we need to turn to figures from Europe, like Walter Benjamin, Marx, and even Derrida, to do this work? I ask because there is an increasing emphasis within the academy on non-Western thinkers and their ideas. What should we think of this turn to the non-West, and what implications does Dr. Mamdani think it carries for decolonizing the political? My second question follows from this quote in the conclusion of the book. Dr. Mamdani writes, decolonization is not simply independence from outside rule. It is an act of thinking and imagination, on page 652. There's a stringent critique of the nation, of the idea of the nation in the book. I want to ask Dr. Mamdani what he thinks about the other dominant category in this book, the state. Of course, there's a long history of critique of the state in political theory, from anarchists to anti-colonialists and feminists. How does Dr. Mamdani conceptualize the state and its coercive functions? Regardless of whichever conception of political community the state is based on, it carries particular political functions of its own in modernity. Nowhere is this more visible than in the politics of security in the age of war on terror, which is ending or has ended. It is through this category of the state that the conception of territory as private, conception of land as private property or territory, or the state as one's own state or land, takes shape in the political consciousness of 20th century in the global South. What about the political nature of the administrative reach and function of the state in modernity? No other time in human history has a model of political control and order be so concerned with classifying, regulating, and managing everyday affairs of their political subjects, to the extent that the state depends itself on the creation of particular kinds of subjectivities. Of course, if the state is one type of universal organizing principle for governance, then the idea of political Islam, and I apologize for this term, is a challenge to this organizing principle because it undermines the theoretical the principle of territorial sovereignty that the state is based on. And not to mention the theoretical challenges posed by more esoteric traditions in Islam, for example, Sufi traditions, or even the ideas of pan-Islamism as they are evident in the Khilafat movement in colonial India, which often stand in tension with national borders and modernist assumptions due to their spiritual and historical background. This relates to my earlier point regarding the decolonization of the political as well. Does decolonization of the political also require unmaking of the project of the state? If it is, then where do we get the intellectual resources for imagining an alternative model of government, which does not just internally reconfigure the state, but actually goes beyond it? This has been a quite of concern for theorists and for political theorists and anthropologists as well, working on issues of secularism and the state in post-colonial and settler colonial contexts. I'm thinking of works by the likes of Sabah Mahmood and Talal Asad and Wael Halak. My last question concerns the category of violence in this book. At one point in the book, Mamdani writes, the political model acknowledges that far from transgression of the normal state of things, violence itself is normal. It is not excess. It is one of the ways in which politics is done. This is not to say that political violence is to be celebrated, but rather it is inevitable how we got here. Page 647. My concern is that rather than concede that this violence is inevitable, isn't it worth to rethink the kind of conduct, disposition, and models of political action and their logics that make virtue out of violence, or at least treat it as instrumentally indispensable? Take, for example, the tradition of Marxist thought in early 20th century, which treats violence as revolutionary necessity or a mere temporal instrument to usher society into the next developmental stage. Or the colonial project, which justified oppression and violence in the present moment to justify gifts of law, civilization, and public order in the future. Or the project of humanitarian intervention, which justifies violence in the present in promise of a security and perhaps even elusive promise of a democracy in the future. All of these modernist visions of politics allocate an understated yet central place to violence and see it as a rational part of creation of order, or how politics is done when aimed at instituting public order. However, we should also remember we should also take note, perhaps, of the greatest critics of violence in politics of the last 2 centuries, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Gandhian critique of violence is often thought of as idealistic, but it is worth noting that the challenges poses to modernist ideas of state-making and construction of political order. Gandhi takes aim at the modernist logic of political action, grounded in the sovereignty and autonomy of the individual, and its perception of control and outcome through the practice of violence. So basically, the assumption that violence will lead to X or Y desirable outcomes, or that instruments of violence, be they individuals or institutions, are perfectly controllable to produce said outcomes. These ideas are underpinned by colonial assumptions and Enlightenment assumptions of sovereignty of human beings over not just land as territory, but all other life on Earth, especially non-humans. Moreover, violence is also grounded in the idea that anti-colonial movements will lead to immediate outcomes of independence as well. A collapsing of complexities of time and politics into an idealism which promises development and entrance into the civilized nations of the world. So any violence practiced in this name is justified. And after all, the immediacy of this promise also supports the practice of violence as communities, nations, and individuals hanker after the political results of decolonization without paying attention to the violent means deployed in the process. My point here is to ask Dr. Mamdani to reflect or comment on how these critiques of violence figured into his work and critique of the nation, and how we might think of non-violence as a virtue to be cultivated. After all, perhaps the greatest purveyor of this idea was shot by someone who thought Gandhi was effeminate and consequently not worthy of representing his nation in a properly masculine and violent way. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamza. There's a lot to unpack there. So I think I have my work cut out for me, but I imagine that Professor Mamdani also does. So I'll give Professor Mamdani an opportunity to respond on his own terms to all the ideas that have been presented by Karen and Hamza here today. But I'll also step in when he's ready to help open up a panel discussion and hear from some of our participants in the room. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Sana. Fortunately, unlike the rest of you, I had requested the panelists to share the outline of their thoughts with me, which they did yesterday. And so I am a little better prepared than the rest of you. As you said, Sana, there's a lot here. And I will leave it to you as chair to decide when to cut me off, since it may not be possible to answer everything within the 15 minutes you have allocated to me. So I'll count on your generosity.
You'll have it. You'll have it. Thank you.
So I'll begin with Karen. If you don't mind, I'll just call you by your first name. I'll begin with Karen, and I thank you for a generous reading of the book. Although I do not share the reading entirely, I will point out where I have a different understanding of what I wrote. To start with, I'm not very comfortable with the characterization utopian vision. I would prefer the characterization to be a little more concrete, to fleshing out what is the content of what you're calling utopian. I would call it a radical vision rather than a utopian vision, because I don't think it's plucked out of thin air. I don't think it's a product of reflection in the splendid isolation of a professor's study. So what is this radical vision about? First of all, it's about reconfiguring the political community from the inside. It's about displacing our notion of the citizen as the bearer of rights with the resident as the bearer of rights. It's about the tension between the citizen and the migrant. Now, this vision was articulated as early as 1955 in the ANC's Freedom Charter. There was a ringing declaration in that Freedom Charter which said, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Not South Africa belongs to all of its citizens, belongs to all who live in it. Now, this contention, citizen or resident, came to surface in 1994 with the question, who can vote in the 1994 elections in South Africa? Only citizens or all residents? The question was of huge significance because there were millions of residents who were not citizens. These were migrant workers from all around, from across the borders of South Africa. These migrant workers had taken the lead in the formation of the trade union movement from the 1970s. They were at the heart of Fosatu and then Cosatu. The decision in 1994 was that all residents have a right to vote. All the migrants, non-citizen migrants voted. The outcome of that election was some kind of a coalition government. The Nakata Freedom Party took charge of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Gatcha Buthelezi became the minister. And from the time he became minister, he systematically proceeded to dismantle the rights of residents who were not citizens. The ministry carried out a systematic, quote, education campaign that migrants were actually parasitic on what should be rights and privileges and welfare reserved exclusively to citizens. What we call xenophobic violence in South Africa today began after 1994 in several stages. So it is this contention, which was already there, 1990s. So if we locate it historically, then it won't seem utopian. It may seem radical, but not utopian. The second thing where I think I have a slightly different reading is I don't think South Africa was as successful as you make it out to be. South Africa's success was in initiating the tendency to detribalization, but not excuse me, in initiating the tendency to deracialization, but not detribalization. The new South African Constitution does not provide equal rights to all citizens. The new South African Constitution makes a distinction between civil rights and customary rights. It guarantees civil rights to all citizens outside of tribally demarcated areas. But within tribally demarcated areas, it defines customary rights which are reserved for only those considered indigenous to the tribe and not to non-indigenous. This is the big difference. This is at the heart of why South Africa has not succeeded in carrying out, in demobilizing xenophobic violence. Because xenophobic violence, if you think about it, one of the most amazing things about xenophobic violence is that it is not aimed at the racial stranger, it is aimed at the tribal stranger. Tribal belonging is still considered tribal political belonging, not cultural belonging. Tribal political belonging is still considered as not an artifact of colonial governance, but as natural to native society. And this is one of the biggest problems. I'll come back to it later. Now, let me come to what would it mean to reform this state of affairs. So in the book, and Karen is quite right, that my ideas on this are really worked through the American example. I learned much from Karen's comments about the Australian situation, of which I haven't read much. So my ideas are worked through the American example. First, the political. I think critical to political decolonization is dismantling the regime of tribal sovereignty, which bases customary rights on tribal belonging, which is responsible for the reproduction of a systemic discrimination, which discriminates between members of different tribes. And I call for a redrawing of the boundaries, because besides the discrimination between members of different tribes, tribal sovereignty also makes permanent the fragmentation between different tribes as institutionalized under the colonial order. So I call for a redrawing of the boundaries to amalgamate fragmented political units into fewer units. That is one. This is, again, remember, this is in the American context. I don't really know the South African context. And then secondly, I call for giving, because in the American context, there's nothing sovereign about tribal units. Tribes are run by a department of the federal state. Those who members of tribes have no constitutionally guaranteed rights. They are wards of the state. And I call for these amalgamated states to be integrated into the constitutional framework of the US, so that they have the same constitutional autonomy as that enjoyed by existing states with settler majorities. And then, of course, I talk of the social, which is the question of reparations. And we can come back to that in our discussion. Karen asks, what hope is there, given that we're living in the aftermath of a genocide of Indian populations in the US, what you call First Nations in Canada or Australia, and I'm not quite clear about this terminology. Whether this ranking, First Nation, Second Nation, Third Nation, which obliterates the distinction between a colonizer and colonized, a conqueror and conquered. I mean, one of my key arguments is that even the problem, the notion of native is highly problematic, because native presumes native to the existing political community. But these are not natives to existing political communities. These were natives to political communities which have been destroyed, which have been truncated. The native is a creation of the settler. The native did not exist before the settler. The settler made the native as somebody who lives within a geography, as somebody who practices custom. And custom is specific to locality. The whole argument is that custom cannot travel. Custom is not part of civilization. It is the settler who creates not custom, but the law, and the law can travel. That is why the settler makes civilization. So, but this politically correct language is politically hollow. So I would like us to think more about it. But back to Karen's question about what hope is there in a post-genocide world where the pre-native population has shrunk into such a minority. So my response is that, look, this is not a question of statistical minority and statistical majority. It's a question of political majority and political minority. Political majorities and minorities are historical. They are created. They don't exist outside of history. Take the example of the US, right? I compare Indians, because that's how these communities refer to themselves. They don't refer to themselves as natives. The museum in Washington, D.C. is not a museum of Native Americans, it's a museum of Indian Americans. So the US, take the example of the Indians and the Africans who were enslaved and brought to the US. The political difference between the two. The Indians were made part of a two-state solution. And two-state here means more than one state. You know, the reservation is a state in this sense. They were made part of a two-state solution, and the Africans part of a one-state solution. The slaves were part of the US. And this had huge political consequences, because a one-state solution provides the possibility of alliance building over time. And you can read the history ever since the Civil War of African Americans, a minority, right? How many are there? 15%, 19%, right? But today they are at the vanguard of the reform process in the US. Black Lives Movement is at the forefront of the reform process. It's not the case with American Indians. The American Indians subjected to a two-state population, confined to political communities, subordinated political communities, even if they are called sovereign tribes, are isolated, politically isolated, fragmented and isolated. Not only fragmented from one another, but isolated from the larger political community. The virtue of a one-state solution is that even if you are oppressed, you can build alliances over time. But the downside of this alliance building so far in the US, including the downside of the Black Lives Matter alliance building, has been that the colonial question has remained peripheral to the alliance building process, to what is called intersectionality. But my point is, again, it's not numbers, it's inclusion. It's the capacity to be part of the larger political process, and therefore to build larger, to broaden the boundaries of mobilization through inclusion. intersectionality. So I'm not talking of revising existing treaties. I don't see a solution there because these are not sovereign communities. It's fiction to think that these are treaties between two sovereign powers. They're not. I think the solution is to make Indians to make what you call First Nations into a part of one state, to begin with creating them as equal citizens under the law. And then on reparations, I'm talking of reparations for communities. I'm not talking of affirmative action for individuals. Affirmative action for individuals has been around for a long time and has done nothing more than help out individuals, leaving bulk of the communities behind. Well, that's Karen, again, thank you very much. I enjoyed reading it. Now I come to Hamza. Do you have any time left?
I'm happy for you to take another 10 minutes if you'd like, Professor.
Another 10 minutes.
And then that will still leave 15
Okay.
minutes for
Okay.
everyone.
So, the thing that struck me when I read Hamza's notes yesterday is that he doesn't focus on the case studies that I discuss in my book. His focus is what I don't discuss in the book, which is India. His remarks on the book are general, a few sentences, but the bulk of his reflection is on India. So we're not going to talk about the book, we're going to talk about India. But I will try and relate the discussion in India to the discussion in the book. So the first thing that struck me about Hamza's reflections is the incredible romanticization of Gandhi. Now I teach a course on decolonization at Makerere University here. And in that course, I teach Gandhi, and my students read Hind Swaraj and Ambedkar, and they read Ambedkar's two books, and Iqbal, because I think that these trio need to be thought together. But this amazing romanticization of Gandhi ignores some things. First of all, Gandhi was modern in one very important sense. Gandhi naturalized the category of nation. Gandhi understood nation the way liberalism does. Because for liberalism, no group identity is legitimate except the identity of nation. And the identity of nation, we know, through it, liberalism creates permanent majorities and permanent minorities, with the majority sovereign and the minority non-sovereign, but tolerated. Now, Hamza confines his reading of Hind Swaraj to Dalits, to untouchables. But far more central in Hind Swaraj are not the untouchables, but Muslims. And for Gandhi, the nation is Hindu. Muslims are outsiders who must be assimilated. Now, the fact is that over 90% Muslims in India are converts to Islam. They are Hindus who converted to Islam. But Gandhi has no conceptual vocabulary to think of converts. His conceptual vocabulary is restricted to foreigners and outsiders coming in, being tolerated, and being assimilated. This is Gandhi at his liberal best. But then I come to comparison of Gandhi and Ambedkar. And I wish that Hamza had focused, had said more about the Pune Pact, Gandhi's threat to fast until death, resulting in the Pune Pact. Gandhi's problem with the Pune Pact, and here I agree with Gandhi, was that he was opposed to separate political representation for Dalits. But Gandhi was not opposed to separate political representation for Muslims because he thought Dalits were part of the nation. Wrong, but Muslims were not. He had a one-state solution for Dalits, but a two-state solution when it came to Muslims. He forced Ambedkar to give up his demand for separate political representation in favor of affirmative action. Now, today in India, we've had affirmative action since the Constitution and the assembly over which Ambedkar presided. These are called reservations. But reservations are only for lower caste Hindus, what are called backward castes and OBCs. There are no reservations for Muslims, no matter how backward or poor, since the Indian Constitution and the Indian polity presumes that Muslims have received benefits from separate political representation. And that benefit is Pakistan. So I think Hamza needs to read Gandhi much more critically and the Pune Pact more comprehensively. Now the question of who is a true Muslim? Who is a true Hindu? One might extend the question. I would suggest that a reading of the chapter on Israel in my book will help us with this question, because one of the key issues Israel has been confronted with ever since its creation is who is a Jew. And there have been two modes of thinking on this. The first, top-down by the state. The state has two definitions of the Jew. One definition is religious. A Jew is whoever practices halakha, personal Jewish law. And the second is a definition of the Jew as an ethnic, member of an ethnic community, not religious community. And this is the definition that is central to the law of return. But even more interesting is how Israeli society has answered the question, who is a Jew? Not the state definition of who is a Jew, but the social definition of a Jew. Zionism, we know, was a Western ideology produced by European Jews from Eastern Europe, the Ashkenazi. After the creation of the State of Israel, you had a huge migration from outside the West, migration of Arab Jews, what are known as the Mizrahim. This was followed by an Ashkenazim project to civilize the Mizrahim. And civilizing the Mizrahim meant to force them to drop their language, their mother tongue, which was Arabic, and to re-identify themselves solely around their religion, Judaism. Now the Mizrahim have resurfaced as the backbone of religious Zionism. And they have two clearly identified enemies, not only the Palestinians, but also the Ashkenazi. So who is a true Muslim? In Pakistan, this is not just excluding the Ahmadiyya, but also the Shia, also the secular Sunni. And today in India, we are in the midst of a process that is sure to pose the question, who is a true Hindu? Hamza asks, where do we draw the anti-colonial thought from? From anti-colonial thinkers, or do we turn to Western thinkers? Walter Benjamin, Derrida, Foucault. Look, neither the Frankfurt School nor Foucault had any time to think of colonialism or anti-colonialism. Why should we turn to them? Why should we even think of turning to them? But I think more importantly, I do not go through anti-colonial thought to decipher and separate good decolonial thought from bad decolonial thought. I do not even focus on intellectual history as my starting point. My starting point is not intellectual history, it's rather social and political history. I don't ignore intellectual history, but it's not my starting point. Now, if you read the chapter on South Africa, I divide this political history into two. Up to the history of nationalism up to 1970s, nationalism which reproduced the architecture of apartheid inside the anti-colonial movement. Right? The colonized organized themselves along definitional lines given to them by apartheid. Africans organized as African National Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, Indians as Indian National Congress, whites as Congress of Democrats. The big change comes in the 1970s. So it does not come from just the head of an intellectual. The intellectual here is Steve Biko. It's systematized by him, but it comes from a movement, Black consciousness movement. I don't think the job of a scholar is to craft a blueprint, as I said earlier, in the splendid isolation of his or her study, but to begin with real social movements, to understand that these continually throw up new ideas, new possibilities, even though, and usually they are, contradictory. The work of the scholar is to present these in a more systematized fashion. Hamza's last question, I think, is about why don't I talk about the state? I talked a lot about the nation. Well, that's what the book is about. So it's not quite fair to ask me to talk about what the book is not about. But I do talk about the state. I mean, you want me to talk about the coercive functions of the state. I have a critique of how neoliberalism, starting with Nuremberg, thinks of state violence. Neoliberalism, Nuremberg, thinks of state violence, it disaggregates it into a whole series of individual projects. It thinks of state violence as criminal. And my argument is that crime, by definition, is committed by an individual. Crime is against the state. The state cannot commit crime. State agents can, but not the state. We have to think of violence not as a criminal project of individuals, but violence as the political project of the state. That's what Nuremberg never did. It never asked the question, what was the Nazi political project? If it had asked, it would have had to answer by saying it was to create a nation state without minorities, a purified nation state. But then it would have had to reflect, the judges would have had to reflect on their own project. So my reflections on the state go so far as to say, I want to talk of a rule of law which translates into equality under the law, unencumbered by national belonging, uncompromised by national belonging. So this is not a book about the state. It's only about one form of the state, the nation state. It's about the state as weaponized by the nation. And it's about the need to decouple the state and the nation. Finally, I think now, again on Saba Mahmood, Talal Asad, Wail Halak, I don't discuss secularism. So please don't look at my book as kind of an encyclopedic answer for whatever questions you may have in your head. It's not. My book does not claim to be do it all or do it yourself manual. So that's not my object. Finally, on violence. I'm sorry. This is the third final, and this would be it. So you want me to talk about modernist notions of violence, and this is not just Marxism. This is everything since the French Revolution, basically, because modernist notions think of violence as either progressive or reactionary. I came to, my first job at the University of Dar es Salaam was in the 1970s. When the Rwanda genocide happened, it just completely destroyed our mindset, because we all believed that violence is either revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. But here was a violence, a genocide, which could neither be seen as revolutionary nor as counter-revolutionary, because this was not the rich against the poor. This was the poor against the poor, the rich against the rich. So how do we think of this violence? And it is the Rwanda genocide which forced me to begin to look elsewhere for a root of violence. And that elsewhere was not the history of the market, of the commodity, but the history of the state. And to stop looking at the state as simply derivative, as simply part of the superstructure. Now, when I think of violence, I am not thinking of violence and non-violence as alternatives. I don't see these alternatives. They go together. They are means that can be used to realize the same end or many ends. So how to deal with violence? I'm not a Gandhian who thinks you can deal with violence through ethical and individual means. But I think that to deal with violence, we have to focus on the grievances around which groups, constituencies mobilize to identify the issues. Therefore, to think of violence not as criminal, but as political. So mine is a critique of the human rights project, of the neoliberal project, its foundational moment being Nuremberg. Thank you very much. I thank you for your generosity in allowing me all this time.
Thank you so much, Professor. Everyone who's come today has come to hear more from you and to listen to this panel, engage critically with and reflectively with the work in relation to their own projects. So thank you for your generosity in receiving the papers from Karen and Hamza. I'm going to open the floor to the group. There are many different directions in which I could sort of take this discussion, but we have 40 participants in the room, and I can see some hands up. So I'm going to go straight to Tinash. You're welcome to turn your camera on and unmute yourself if you would like. Oh, we can't hear you. I'll try again. I'm not sure if any of our hosts can help.
How was that?
Beautiful.
Excellent. All right. Okay, so thank you. That was a very interesting panel. I can't say I found everything that was said as compelling as perhaps some of the attendees, but not having read the book, from what I could gather from the discussion, Professor Mamdani, you argue that South Africa is a successful example of decolonizing the political, but arguably South Africa is an excellent example of the failure to decolonize the political and a prime example of the continued reenactment of colonial violence in the post-independence period. So the model of reconciliation that was employed in the South African context and the attendant narrative of the Rainbow Nation have consistently restricted the country's capacity to decolonize the country's different social spheres, including as relates to land, to the redistribution of land and wealth, which continue to be principally controlled by a white minority. So it seems to me that if indeed you are arguing that South Africa is representative of a good example of the decolonization of the political, it seems to me that this flawed analysis of the South African context highlights some of the ways in which purportedly radical visions of the reconstitution of social and political organization are not exempt from the seductive power of narratives such as the Rainbow Nation and the functions they perform in curtailing decolonization in the post-independence period. My question then is, to what extent do you actually believe that South Africa is a successful example of decolonizing and de-racializing the political? And to the extent that you do believe that it is such a successful example, why is it that you do? Cheers.
Thank you. May I, should I answer or should we wait for more questions?
You're welcome to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Tinashe, I am heartened by your first sentence that you've not read the book. So let this be the beginning of a conversation, which I hope will advance once you've read the book. So South Africa is not a success and not a failure in unqualified terms. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? Now, most writings on South Africa today focus on the failure side of it. And the argument is that there has been no social justice in South Africa, starting with the land question. And I agree completely. There has been no social justice. But I ask, why hasn't there been social justice? Because there was no revolution in South Africa. What there was in South Africa, at most, was an impasse. So why did the apartheid regime decide to come to the negotiating table? I think for two reasons. One, the anti-apartheid mobilization was basically restricted to the townships. The nightmare would be if the mobilization extended from the townships to the homelands, to the tribal areas. Because if it did, it would have to target now not just the apartheid authority, but the homeland authorities. And by targeting the homeland authorities, it would dismantle the fragmentation along tribal lines. That was the first nightmare. But I think there was a bigger nightmare. And the bigger nightmare was the Afrikaner government, the National Party, realized that it was beginning to lose the Afrikaner intelligentsia. Beginning with the trade union mobilization of the 1970s, where a handful, less than 100, had moved to work with the building of trade unions in the hostels amongst migrant laborers. But they understood that once they lost the white intelligentsia, they would lose the white population. Because apartheid, like Zionism, was a democratic project in the white community. The National Party was brought to power through elections. There was no coup d'etat. So this was the second nightmare. Now, do I think that even as political demobilization, this was an unqualified success? No, I don't think so. I think the success part was basically with deracialization. The failure was with the lack of any detribalization. Do I think that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is something to emulate? I don't think so. In the book, I have a critique of TRC as basically a reenactment of Nuremberg, as basically reducing violence to criminal violence, individual violence, as failing to understand the political nature of the violence and the violence of the apartheid state. I also argue in the book that it is not the TRC which led to the first steps to political decolonization, but it was the talks, the very hard-nosed talks at Kempton Park, where there was a trade-off between equal rights, formal equal rights in the civil sphere, not in the customary sphere, formal rights in the civil sphere, for the white community being allowed to keep its ill-gotten gains. That is the Constitution. The Constitution has three parts to it. One is equal civil rights. Two is a continuation of colonially defined customary rights. And three is to have no reference to social justice. Private property is part of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Land is not part of the Bill of Rights. And my argument is that the political reconciliation is going to be temporary and cannot be durable without social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tinash and Professor Mamdani. We are bang on time and I see no more hands up for the questions. So I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to draw our panel discussion today to a close. I want to thank Professor Mamdani for being both generous with his time and the way in which he has received the engagements and critical challenges from the discussion today. I encourage everyone who has not yet read the book to access it and purchase it and do so. There is in Professor Mamdani's work a rich empirical problem-based account of these forms of relations between the colonial constructions of native and settler, of which all of us in different ways can engage constructively and critically in relation to our own projects. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much again to Professor Karen Farquharson, Dr. Hamza bin Jehangir, and of course to Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Enjoy your evening all.
Thank you, Sana.
Yeah, thank you, Sana. So everyone, before you go, I would like to draw your attention to tomorrow's program. So this panel is the last event of our program today, but it's not the last event of our conference. Tomorrow, we are going to have two practitioner panels, one on the topic of community engagement and the other one on the topic of network. In the evening, we will conclude the conference with a cultural performative presentation by Stephanie Kanyada Hui. I think Stephanie is here with us. Hello, Stephanie. And she is a Rwandan British composer and a multidisciplinary artist. So Stephanie and her collaborator, Ben OP, will be presenting their work to us. It's a special presentation where we will not just have conversations, but we have really music and creative work to explore together. It's very exciting. So yeah, look forward to see everyone tomorrow. And as for the conference dinner tomorrow, unfortunately, we have to postpone it because of the latest COVID restrictions. Yeah, but I can assure you that we will definitely reschedule it, and we still have the chance to meet each other in person after the lockdown, and we will have good conversation and good African food together. So like for any like updates on the dinner and also any future African studies groups events, we actually have a mailing list for you to join. You will get this link, the link to our mailing list in tomorrow's program mass email as well, but I'm sending it here to everyone as well. Okay, so I'll see you all tomorrow. Stay safe and have a lovely evening.